Hello, everyone, and welcome to Chapter 3 of your senior project. It is week 4, and we'll be talking about the chapter where you map out your methodology, your descriptions of the studies and the methods that you use to test your hypotheses in Chapter 4. Now, all you're doing in this chapter is you are describing study by study what studies you'll use, the research you'll use from those studies to test your hypotheses later. But you're not talking about your hypotheses in this chapter, okay? Other than to give a quick introduction at the beginning to remind the reader of what are your hypotheses. However, the focus of this chapter is on this. It's a detailed description of each of the studies you'll use to later test the hypothesis. Now, do not confuse this with the literature review. The literature review in Chapter 2 gave a general summary of the history of the research of your topic. This chapter actually goes study by study. You're picking the most prominent recent studies that you can use, recent research that you can use to later test your hypotheses, and describing how that information was obtained. How did that experiment or research come about? All the details, okay? So let's take a look at that and how you would organize Chapter 3. Okay, the title of this chapter, of course, is Methodology, your description of studies and the methods used. So, and you are absolutely welcome to use that literally at the beginning of Chapter 3, like all the chapter headings. So, Chapter 3, you want to describe each of the studies, study by study. You'll use the outcomes to test your hypothesis or hypotheses later. So you want to describe how the data was collected that you will use to test your hypothesis later. Okay, I know it sounds like a beating dead horse, but I just want to make very sure everybody understands that this is not where you're actually testing your hypothesis. You are basically making sure the reader knows all the details about what studies you'll use to later do that. Okay, so here are the steps in writing Chapter 3. You want to make sure start with an introduction, of course, where you briefly describe. This chapter will map out or describe in detail the studies that will later be applied to testing the hypotheses in Chapter 4. I mean, basically that could be your first sentence. And then just remind the reader one more time, what are your hypotheses or hypothesis, okay? You want to make sure that you identify, as I said at the beginning of the course, start looking for the really prominent and important studies that tested data that you can use to test your hypotheses later. Okay, so you're looking for the most detailed and important studies. You want to identify 3 to 5 of them. 3 is pretty sparse. I would say going 4 or 5 is really the way to go, because you really want to make sure you have plenty plenty to test your own hypotheses later. Plenty of research, plenty of data that you can use. Okay, so you're identifying 3 to 5 studies. They may directly test a hypothesis that is similar or the same as yours, or they may just test something that's related to it, okay, that you will later use to correlate. Okay, so identify 3 to 5 studies or sources of data that you can use to test your hypothesis or hypotheses. Okay, in some case it might be data from the Census Bureau, and some of it's going to be very general, but you still need to go through and describe exactly how that information was gathered. So let's take it study by study. The subheads in this chapter, you want to make sure you go study by study. So after your introductory couple of paragraphs, you have study 1, and then start with the names of the people who conducted the study. and the year that they conducted it. So study 1, Joe Schmo and Bill, Bill Green or something. You could use just last names as well. And the year it was conducted, like 2012 or 2019, whatever it is. Okay, that's the subhead. And then underneath that, you just describe the methods used in the study. And I'll get to that in just a minute. After you've described everything the reader needs to know about study 1, then you go on and talk about study 2. Okay, so you're going study by study. Okay, so what do you do for each study? Well, what do you describe? Well, here is the list you want to make sure you have close, because you want to go make sure that you have described in essay form, okay, full sentences and paragraphs, each of these items if possible. Okay, in other words, some studies may not have a particular may not have terms that are only particular to that study. So you don't have to worry about definitions or something. But make sure you go through this list for yourself, get to remind yourself to get as much of that information as you possibly can gathered, and then write your description based on this. Okay, so you need the setting. What is the setting? The setting is what, where did the experiment take place? Was it in a laboratory? Was it in, was it in Seattle? Was it in, in the United States? And where? Was it in several different locations? Okay, you also want to describe the subjects. Were they all from a certain demographic group, a certain socioeconomic background? Were they all born in 1972? Were they all, you see what I'm saying? You want to make sure you describe the subjects, and don't be general about it. Don't say they came from all walks of life. No, you gotta get as much information as you possibly can. You may, in some cases, have to call or email the people who conducted the study, the experiment, in order to get additional information. You want a description of the research instrument. So the lab, how did they go about testing this? How did they go about studying this particular topic? Okay. You want a description of the variables. What were the independent variables being tested? What were the dependent variables, which are the outcomes? Okay. Definition of terms. Some experiments are going to have very specific terminology that they use for their studies. Make sure the reader understands those. Procedures. You want to make sure you describe the procedures involved. And at the end of each study, explain what are the limitations. Did they only test it on 250 people and make a general statement about all people based on those 250? Did they, all the people who participated in the study, were they all, grad students who had the time on their hands to do this, or needed the money? So, was it always at the same time of day when this particular stimulus was being tested, or hypothesis being tested? And if so, did that affect it? That sort of thing. What are the holes in the study? So you're looking for what are the weaknesses, what are the limitations as well. How, what would have been great if they had a random sample of subjects coming from all over the world and that sort of thing. But, that's not always, in fact, it's very seldom possible. Okay. Then you want to go on and do it again with study 2, study 3, study 4, study 5. Okay. Now, as with all the chapters, you want to start with chapter 3, and you can say methodology or something like that. You want to make sure, though, that at the top of the first page, it looks like that first level of APA style heading. So it needs to be centered, bold-faced. The big words need to start with a capital letter. Some little words can be all lowercase, okay? But make it like the title of a movie or a book. It should be like number 1 there. It should be centered on the page. So chapter 3, methodology, okay? Under each one, for each study, you want it to be, the subhead to be left aligned, bold-faced, uppercase and lowercase heading. And then when you break it down further, you can go into levels 3 and possibly 4 or 5 if that's needed. Okay, you don't want to do a different subhead for every paragraph, but keep it very well organized so the reader understands exactly what you're doing at each point. Okay? Okay, that's pretty much chapter 3, you guys. So if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask. Email me, or you can jump onto the virtual office and post your questions there. I'm always happy to get them. Thank you so much for watching this video, and have an absolutely wonderful week. Thank you for attending.